I think someone gave me D&D at a rave back in 1996, and we don't talk about that night. So, Andrew, and this is Gayties Toys. On today's MIA 80s Ladies, we're going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons again. We did a video way back when about the cartoon and really how the toy line should have and probably could have really benefited from, focusing on that. And I did allude to how we had to go back and deal with the toy line that we actually got. So today's the day. So today we're going to talk about Skylla from Dungeons & Dragons. In the last video, we talked about sort of Dungeons & Dragons as a whole, as well as the cartoon that did, air in the 1980s. I did allude in that video that we had to come back to the toy line, and LJN's toy line is one that may not have been super successful at the time, but has really sort of grown into a cult following since. It was sort of, a huge property at that time. It really exploded with teenagers and, of course, moms who thought it was, part of the whole satanic panic. Despite that, LJN and Mego both were vying for the license for D&D, and in 1982, LJN was the one who won out. Whereas the cartoon really focused on, a bunch of kids within the D&D realm, and is or is not canon, depending on your own personal headcanon or the source books you trust. But, if you know me, you know my penchant for damn kids and series. However, LJN decided to go in a different route, and they sort of really focused on the realm of Dungeons & Dragons and sort of created a whole cast of characters based off of the different, classes you could get in the game. There have been dissertations on why there's a disparity between the cartoon and the toy line. There's no real definitive answer, and here's my hot take. I feel like this line was sort of a little ahead of its time, in the sense that it wasn't really courting kids. Kids were watching the cartoon, which granted, there was a huge gap between the cartoon and the toy line. This was 1983, the whole, marketing machine of how to launch a toy line and a cartoon and bed sheets and cereal. It hadn't really been formulated, or really kind of established quite yet. That said, I mean, the market for the D&D figures seems to be more towards teenagers who, especially in the 1980s, were not buying toys. So this really was more ahead of its time than anything. This line was really, something that would have really flown in the 90s when we were getting Toy Biz X-Men, Spawn, Power of the Force, Star Trek, when the adult collector community really started to kind of coalesce. This line would have succeeded wildly, but in 1983, it just didn't really find an audience. Now, this being early to mid 80s and LJ on top of that. I mean, these people were not scared to make women. So we did get, two characters within the line, one being a cleric whose name I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce, as well as much more popularly Tiamat, one of the more recognizable dragons in the whole franchise. That said, there was another character who was at least believed to have been planned for Wave 1, and we have sort of evidence of that in the back packaging of some of the Bendy monster figures, where Skylla was listed. We would never get a figure of her within the actual figure line. However, LJN did make, again, Bendy figures, as well as sort of like little non-action figurable, like PVC figures that you could sort of, in theory, play on your D&D boards with. She was listed as one of the figures who was meant to be in the actual figure line, but she did make her way into the PVC line. So at the very least, we did see what she looked like. That said, we've never found any kind of prototype or, what the actual figure would look like. So it's unknown if that just hasn't surfaced yet or they never actually even made her. While some characters from the toy line would find themselves in the cartoon in at least, an attempted sort of cross-promotional marketing package here, much like Strongheart or Warduke, or again, the previously mentioned Tiamat, Skylla did not make an appearance in the cartoon. And so as for her character, we don't really have a whole lot. Her little PVC figure, she was, a pretty well-renowned sorceress. They sort of made it a point that, women in this realm sort of had it like a little extra tougher. So she had to be a little extra tougher in the magic field. So that sort of, that resolve made her all the more powerful. And she really was someone who used a lot of relics and artifacts and that kind of thing. So certainly interesting, and certainly someone who would be, a real powerhouse on your team. But beyond that, we never actually got her in media. Nevertheless, leading credence to the fact that she was probably, at the very least planned for Wave 1, she was featured in, puffy stickers, which I love, and shrinky dinks, and that kind of thing. So, as much as she was sort of, one of those characters who was sort of baked into the origin of the toy line, never actually got a figure. Except, while the line wasn't particularly a smash success back in the 80s, the notion of it, the legacy of it is quite big. I mean, people do really have quite fond feelings for the toy line. That Fortress of Fangs playset is one of the best of the 80s. That's just an objective fact. Skylla herself would sort of dart in and out of the franchise ever since. So, she would appear in, of course, campaigns, books, what have you. In terms of merchandise, the first real sign of her outside of the 80s would have been the Icons of the Realm League of Malevolence, made by WizKids, which was, another little sort of set of small figurines that were at the very least painted that you could use on your D&D game and campaigns. All that is to say is, and this is sort of one of my favorite kind of final verdict-y type stories, is that NECA was, in the business of doing Dungeons and Dragons, particularly the toy line. So they've done a lot of 7-inch figures and repaints, let's say, of Warduke and characters like that. So it would be great to see her finally realized in that toy line, but what they did do right by was in San Diego Comic-Con 2022, one of their exclusives was what's called the Lost Wave, where they took figures that were planned but never made. And she was one of the ones that were created for this line. Don't love that it's exclusive, but at the same time too, it was a great way for these characters to get out. And while they might not survive on retail, it was at least, a happy ending if this was a character that you did want on your shelf. And since we're here, and just for completionist sake, Super 7 is also in the Dungeons and Dragons game currently. They've done sort of reaction figures based off of more of the box art from way back, as well as the cartoon itself. For the reaction figure specifically, they made a character from the original box art for D&D called simply the Sorceress. So, similar scale, different style, but another character who, we never got in any line. So, again, someone else you might consider if you're in the market for the ladies of D&D. And that'll do it for Dungeons & Dragons and the ladies thereof. I wasn't really into it at the time. I rarely even saw them on toy shelves. And of course, I was very into He-Man and Star Wars. And of course, G.I. Joe and Transformers were coming out. So it really did get lost in the mix. But I think, like a lot of people, if I'm reading the room here correctly, we sort of discovered it after the fact. And it is really a great, fun little line. And it makes such a really handsome little display. I, of course, have not done that because I live in an apartment, and this is already out of control. But I think it's, still reasonably priced, still a fun little line, and again, now you can sort of, fill in some blanks that we never got to, and those are my favorite kinds of stories in this case, where you can actually, complete vintage lines, as well as, even go forward and hope for some more modern, articulated 7-inch lines, maybe in the future. So we'll see if NECA continues with that. That said, thank you for watching, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, all those YouTubey things, and I'll see you next time on MIA 80s Ladies.